I'd like to highlight briefly the threat that the growing refugee and displaced person problem is posing to global stability. We've talked about Syria. I'd like to talk globally. Second, to emphasize the importance that preventive measures and contingency planning can make in trying to mitigate these threats. And then third, conclude, here in the spirit of Fleet Week, of noting the very unique role that the United States military does and can play in HADR operations. So first, a few words about the threat and the steady increase in refugees and displaced persons poses to global stability and indeed to economic well-being. Some data. For 2012, the Center on Research of Epidemiology of Disasters registered 310 natural disasters. These affected 106 million people. And according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, approximately 32.4 million people, over 32 million people, were newly displaced by sudden onset of disasters, natural disasters, in the year 2012. But this number, 32.4 million, that really understates the problem because it doesn't encompass the displacement related to habitat loss or food and livelihood insecurity that's caused by the slow onset of disasters or gradual environmental degradation, including drought and desertification. These are very hard to measure. Globally, in 2012, last year, disasters caused economic losses that came in at $138 billion, which is continuing a very worrisome trend where for the first time ever now in 2012, we've had 3 years running where the total cost and price of these natural disasters has totaled over $100 billion. Some 6 million refugees now, 1/4 of Syria's population, with estimates now of 2 million are now refugees beyond Syria's borders. All of this adds up to some very massive economic cost, and very importantly, something, Mike, you were talking about, the steady erosion of states' ability to provide responsible sovereignty for their people, and the corollary of this, the steady expansion of ungoverned space in this world. And this includes now even urban areas in relatively advanced industrialized countries. All of this then, that ungoverned space, fostering the growth of disenfranchisement, terrorism, and criminality. If you look at Afghanistan in the 1990s, catastrophic humanitarian problem, catastrophic refugee problem, and did the world pay a price for that some years later? So given the scope of the problem and the worrisome trend lines that I've just mentioned, I believe that we do need to move beyond response and reaction to more emphasis on prevention and contingency planning, which brings me to my second observation. Prevention includes giving more attention, very frankly, to climate change. I believe that many in this audience are increasingly finding yourselves dealing with a set of problems that are really symptoms of climate change. Because of your enormous prestige and your credibility, I would urge you to add your voices to the global debate ongoing about the importance of taking preventative measures and taking real action. And while efforts at preparation for crises response, such as stockpiling, early warning, evacuation planning, and simulations, are and will into the future remain very essential, investment in building resilient communities is also necessary. And what does this mean? It requires collaboration between HADR and development experts and their organizations. Firsthand experience of myself as the commander of the coalition forces in Afghanistan. In 2006, I went to Bamiyan province in the center of Afghanistan. and I visited outside of the capital city of Bamiyan, a refugee camp. And the conditions in this refugee camp were so moving. It was my only time as a commander of our forces that publicly I lost my composure. And yet, what I looked at in that refugee camp was collaboration between the humanitarian assistance teams from the United Nations and the development community. So as poor as the conditions were, as desperate as the conditions were, still the development community working side by side. Schools were getting open. There were cash for work programs. There was a premium being placed on trying to get permanent resettlement right outside of Bamiyan city. And so even in those desperate conditions, there was still hope. Unless you think that this concept of building resilient communities only applies, say, to Afghanistan, to Somalia, or the Sahel, look at some of the lingering problems we have right here in our own country in some of the communities that were impacted some years ago by Katrina and more recently by Sandy. So unless development strategies are formulated in advance and then applied at the front end of a crisis, we risk chronic and recurring HADR problems. Consider this. Despite advocacy and evidence that clearly suggests that prevention and preparedness are more effective and cheaper than response, between the period 2006 and 2010, only 3% of humanitarian aid was spent on disaster prevention and preparedness. So it's clear that we do need to do better. Contingency planning can also be improved by continuing efforts to better data acquisition, standardization, and feedback to so-called consumers. So my third and final observation is about the unique role that the United States military, any good military for that matter, can play in HADR operations. The United States Armed Forces, as all of you know here, they're expeditionary in their design. They're prepared to respond very quickly to unforeseen contingencies anywhere around the world, and they can scale up at a remarkably fast pace. They bring to the table a set of capabilities that can often make their participation absolutely crucial, absolutely indispensable in the contribution that they can make to the network of actors responding to a sudden massive humanitarian crisis. What can they bring to the table? They offer real-time intelligence and situational awareness in very impressive ways, and ways that are getting more impressive with each month. They offer ground, sea, and air transportation. They offer reliable, comprehensive communications, emergency medical response, deep logistics, vertical and horizontal construction capability, and they can provide security. Perhaps most important, the United States military excels at crisis response planning, which is so critical, especially in the first few days and weeks after the onset of an unforeseen large-scale disaster. I've been directly involved in two major international HADR operations that have been supported by the United States Armed Forces and our broader civilian interagency teams. In 2004, as Mike mentioned, in the aftermath of the tsunami that devastated Aceh, and again, in 2005, I was actually commanding the U.S.-led coalition in Afghanistan, and then was put in charge of our military efforts to assist the government of Pakistan respond to the devastating Kashmir earthquake that killed some 80,000 Pakistani civilians. And during the command of the U.S.-led coalition contribution to the Pakistani earthquake relief, I tell you that I, the Pakistani government, and countless NGOs were fully impressed with the speed and the capability of delivery of, first, a joint primarily Air Force planning and operations center, which very frankly was, for the first 2 weeks, the initial hub of almost all of the relief activity going on in Pakistan. Number two, a Navy construction battalion that arrived within a week of the earthquake, and they began to immediately clear rubble from urban areas and opened up blocked roads that were preventing relief from flowing into the Kashmir valleys. Third, an Army field hospital that saved countless lives, and very importantly, was staffed so they could treat Pakistani females. And with that capability, the Pakistani men from traditional areas in the Kashmir Valley were very comfortable with their women going to that hospital. And fourth and finally, a Marine air traffic control team that enabled safe helicopter operations and countless sorties of aircraft from over a dozen contributing nations. But beyond this, what I witnessed in Pakistan, as I had in Aceh in Indonesia the previous year, is the manner that our armed forces can help illuminate the good side of America, which seems so often to be obscured these days by the complexity and the messiness of international affairs. I'm very impressed to be here today in this great city in the greater Bay Area, and to have learned firsthand now that due to Mike's leadership and a lot of support from the mayor and Lewis and Secretary Schultz, from Senator Feinstein, that there's this tradition and spirit of building civilian military partnerships to take advantage of what our armed forces can bring to the HADR table. So I'll stop here. Major General Myatt, Lewis, thank you for allowing me to participate in this very excellent gathering, and I look forward to talking during the reception to any of you who might have questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.